being monsters. There should also be at least some mention here about the psychological study done at Stanford University in 1971, in which a sort of mock prison was set up, with dozens of students appointed as mock prisoners and others as mock prison guards. The experiment had to be terminated early after only 6 days because those who had been given authority, the guards, had become shockingly callous, abusive, and sadistic towards their prisoners. It must be noted that the abuse committed by the guards even went beyond what they were told to do by those running the experiment, which was designed to humiliate and degrade the prisoners. This shows that the personal, malicious, or sadistic tendencies in an individual is a significant contributing factor to such abuse, that most people openly act out such tendencies only when given a position of authority that they believe gives them permission to do so. The same phenomenon can be seen in all sorts of abuses of power, whether by a bureaucrat on a power trip, a soldier or police officer who likes to bully or assault victims, or any other official who enjoys lording his power over others. These demonstrate that not only does the belief in authority allow basically good people to become tools of oppression and injustice, but it also brings out and dramatically amplifies whatever potential for malice, hatred, sadism, and love for domination those people may possess. The superstition of authority begins by making average people mere agents of evil, which Arden described as the banality of evil, but then goes on to make such people personally evil by convincing them that they have the right or even the duty to abuse and oppress other people. This can be seen in the behaviors of soldiers, police prosecutors, judges, even petty bureaucrats. Anyone whose job consists of harassing, extorting, threatening, and coercing and controlling decent people will sooner or later become at least callous, if not downright sadistic. One cannot continually act like a monster without eventually becoming one. Another important thing to note, as shown in countless examples of abuses of power, is that while a belief in authority can lead people to inflict harm on others, that same belief often cannot limit the extent to which the agents of authority hurt other people. For example, many individuals who would never oppress an innocent person on their own become police officers, thereby acquiring the legal power to commit a certain degree of oppression. Yet on many occasions, they end up going well beyond the legal oppression they are authorized to commit and become sadistic, power-happy monsters. The same is true, perhaps even more so, of soldiers. Perhaps the reason many combat veterans end up being deeply emotionally traumatized is not so much the result of thinking about what they have witnessed, as it is a result of thinking about what they themselves have done. The high rate of suicide among combat veterans supports this thesis. It makes little sense for someone to wish for his own death simply because he has seen something horrible. It makes a lot more sense for someone to wish for his own death because he himself has done something horrible and has in fact become something horrible. The reason that the belief in authority can drive people to commit evil, but in the end cannot limit the evil they commit, is simple. Aside from whatever technical limitations they are supposed to be an agent of authority, the primary concept that the enforcer is taught, and the primary concept that he must accept in order to do his job, is that, as a representative of authority, he is above the common folk and has the moral right to forcibly control them. In short, he is taught that his badge and his position make him a rightful master of all the average people. Once he is convinced of that lie, it should be expected that he will despise the average citizen and treat him with contempt in the same way, and even for the same reason, that a slave owner will treat his slaves not as human beings but as property, whose feelings and opinions matter no more than the feelings and opinions of a master cattle or his furniture. It is very telling that that many modern law enforcers quickly become angry, even violent, when the average citizen simply speaks to the officer as an equal instead of assuming the tone and demeanor of the subjected underling. Again, this reaction is precisely the same and has the same cause as the reaction a slave master would have to an uppity slave speaking to him as an equal. There are plenty of examples depicted in numerous police videos on the internet of supposed representatives of authority going into a rage and resorting to open violence simply because someone approached, spoke to them as one adult would speak to another instead of speaking as a subject would speak to a master. The state mercenaries refer to this lack of groveling as someone having an attitude. In their eyes, someone treating them as mere mortals, as if they are on the same level as someone else, amounts to showing disrespect for their alleged authority. Similarly, anyone who does not consent to being detained, questioned, or searched by officers of the law is automatically perceived by the mercenaries of the state as some sort of troublemaker who has something to hide. Again, the real reason such lack of cooperation annoys authoritarian enforcers is because it amounts to people treating them as mere humans instead of treating them as superior kings, which is what they imagine themselves to be. If someone was confronted by a stranger without a badge who started interrogating the person in an obviously accusatory way and then asked them to be allowed to search the person's pockets, his car, and his home, not only would the person be accosted, almost certainly refuse, but he would probably also be outraged at the request. Of course you can't rummage through my stuff. Who do you think you are? But when strangers with badges make such requests, they are the ones offended when the targets of their intrusive, unjustified harassments, accusation, and searches for objects, and people refuse to cooperate. Even when the officers know full well that the Fourth and Fifth Amendments to the U.S. Constitution specifically dictate that a person has no legal duty to answer questions or consent to searches, such lack of cooperation, i.e., the failure to unquestioningly bow to the enforcer's every whim and request, is still seen by the police as a sign that the person must be some sort of criminal and enemy of the state. From the perspective of law enforcers, only a despicable lowlife would ever treat representatives of authority in the same manner as he treats anyone else. Again, this is not how most of these people view the world before becoming officers of the law. In their authoritarian enforcement training, they are specifically taught to treat people as inferiors, to only try to gain control of everyone and everything the moment they arrive on the scene, telling everyone where to go, what to do, when they can speak, and so on. They are not merely told that they have the right to boss everyone around, which would be dangerous enough. They are trained that they must, in every situation, use whatever it takes, commands, intimidations, or outright violence, to get everyone present to bow to their authority, and are taught that it is a crime for anyone to fail to unquestioningly bow to their will, which they characterize as disobeying a lawful order. It is also very significant that it is customary for police, as soon as they arrive on any scene, to make sure no one else is armed with any sort of weapon and to disarm anyone who is before knowing anything about who the people are or what is going on, and even regardless of whether the people are legally armed. The obvious purpose of this practice is to immediately create a huge imbalance of power where only the law enforcers have the ability to forcibly impose their will on others. Imagine the arrogance required for an average citizen to arrive on some scene, unfamiliar with the situation and the people involved, and have his first thought be, "No one's allowed to have a weapon except me." In short, law enforcers are trained to be oppressive megalomaniacs and to treat everyone else as cattle. And human nature being what it is, anyone who routinely treats others that way, the way law enforcers are required to treat anyone else, will learn to despise others and treat them with contempt, disrespect, and hostility. However good or bad at heart an individual is to begin with, the way to bring out the worst in him is to give him authority over others. Author's personal note. Several former police officers have personally told me that they quit the force after they noticed that the job and their supposed authority was slowly turning them into monsters, one of them using that exact word. In fairness, many law enforcers make an effort to be nice guys and at least attempt to treat others with respect. But ultimately, they cannot treat others as equals and still be law enforcers. They can be friendly and even apologetic about it. Sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you. But their job still requires to coercively control and extort others, and not just those who have accidentally harmed someone. A cop cannot treat others as equals without losing his job. Imagine an officer who would do traffic stop or search places or detain and interrogate anyone or use physical force against someone only in situations in which you would feel justified in doing so yourself without any badge or law telling you you could. The same holds true of government investigators, prosecutors, and judges. And government employees who refuse to investigate, prosecute, or sentence someone for a victimless crime would quickly lose his job. It is not up to the agents of authority to decide which laws to enforce. If there are morally legitimate laws, as there always all branches of authoritarian law enforcement are required to enforce them, thereby assisting in the extortion and oppression of innocent people. Even if much of what he does is aimed at actual criminals, those who have committed acts of aggression against others, every law enforcer, as part of the job, is required to commit acts of aggression himself. There are some who do almost nothing other than initiating violence, such as tax collectors, narcotics agents, and immigration agents. This makes it literally impossible, in almost all cases, to work for government without committing immoral acts of aggression. Being a law enforcer and being a moral person are almost always mutually exclusive. However politely they may do the job, and despite the fact that they always go after actual criminals, the kind who have victims, law enforcers are always professional aggressors, subjugating the people to the will of the politicians by way of violence and the threat of violence. And anyone who does that, if he did not already have a certain degree of contempt and hatred for his fellow man, will almost certainly develop it. To put it another way, even the nicest, most friendly slave owner, if he continues to believe the legitimacy of slavery and continues to practice it, will be committing evil and will inflict harm upon the people he imagines to be his rightful property. And he will naturally develop a degree of contempt towards the victims of his aggression and will behave contemptuously towards them. The ability of the authority belief to create harm and simultaneously inability of it to limit harm once the master imagines himself to have the right to rule over his inferiors can be seen not only on an individual basis but on a large scale as well. Most of the debates and writings that led up to the ratification of the US Constitution focused on limiting the powers of the federal government would have, and on discussing all of the things that it was not allowed to do. The Bill of Rights, for example, is a list of things the government is constitutionally prohibited from doing. In fact, the Ninth and 10th Amendments make it an open-ended list so that the federal government, in theory, was not supposed to do anything except what the Constitution specifically authorized it to do. Nonetheless, with the possible exception of the Third Amendment, the Bill of Rights also happens to be a list of rights that federal agents violate every single day in every single state in the Union. In reality, whether on any individual or national level, telling someone, you have the right to rule others, but only within these limits, will sooner or later result in that person dominating others without recognizing any limits to his power. In the long run, there is no such thing and can be no such thing as limited government, because once someone is accepted by others as a rightful master and believes himself to have the moral right to rule, there will be nothing and no one above him with the power to restrain him. Inside a government, a higher authority might choose to limit a lower authority, but logic and experience have shown that an authoritarian hierarchy, taken as a whole, will never limit itself for long. Why would it? Why would a master ever put his own interests below the interests of his slaves? The Constitution is a perfect example of this. A piece of parchment which purported to grant very limited authority to certain people, but which utterly failed to stop those people from going beyond those limits, creating something that eventually grew into the most powerful authoritarian empire in history. And the problem cannot be solved by appointing other sets of masters, e.g., examples, a court system, inside the same authoritarian structure with the supposed purpose of enforcing limits upon the first set of masters. Separation of powers and checks and balances and due process are meaningless if the masters and those assigned to limit them are both part of the same authoritarian organization.